first thing President Oaks does in office is he makes changes to the scriptures, the most sacred, one of the most sacred aspects of our entire religion. And so we're going to talk about it today. If everyone thought that President Oaks was not going to be a catalyst for change, this last week is quickly disabusing us of that notion, because not only has he made changes to the scriptures in the few days that he has been the prophet, but he has also announced 55 new missions, which is blowing my mind. So we're going to talk about both of those things today. We're going to start off talking about the scriptural changes, because that's a big deal. The last time that the scriptures were changed was in 2013, so over 10 years ago. So we're going to talk about what the church actually announced with this big thing, how we're going to like grapple with changes to the scriptural canon in general. We're going to go through like some of the more significant changes, because there are some big ones, there are some small ones, and why the church made this change at all, because it's a big deal to decide to change the scriptural canon. And then we're going to talk about the missions, because that is a huge deal. So to get started, let's talk about the announcement the church made. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can all look at the church newsroom article, and we are going to get going. So share entire screen, it's because we're going to be flipping between tabs here.
It would be really funny if, I know that this has probably been like in the works for a while now, but it'd be really funny if, like, a week ago, President Oaks was like, you know what? New scriptures, let's do it, guys. And just kind of sight unseen. Like, you know what? 55 new missions. Let's do it. Why not?
Let's get a whole new revelation. So that's not exactly what this announcement is. It's not quite so dramatic as like receiving new scripture, but we're making changes to scripture. And it's a big deal. This does not happen often in the Latter-day Saint world, but we do believe in an open canon. So when it does, it's still very exciting. So this was the article. They released it yesterday, and they're talking about how some minor adjustments have been made to section introductions to the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Mormon. So that is like a pretty big distinction. They're not making changes to the scriptural text, the actual revelatory material, but they are making changes to the introduction. So that is like this section part of the Doctrine and Covenants. And even if you think that's not a big deal, because it's just giving like historical context, these usually have a big impact on how people interpret the revelation. If you just had the text of the revelation itself, it's hard to understand, but these introductions really give a lot of context to what's going on. So, and there's some that, again, are minor, and others that I think have big implications for our interpretation of them. So here's the table that the church gave of the changes made. So this first page are just like the small changes. And a lot of them, these changes from what the church was describing, are from the Joseph Smith papers. So since the church started the Joseph Smith papers process, collecting all of the documents, digitizing all the documents, transcribing all the documents, what tends to happen is the historians are reviewing a lot of these revelations and detecting errors we didn't know existed before, or learning more about the order in which revelations were received, the dating and the timing, all of that. So a lot of this is dates. So like, for example, it says section 107 in the old scriptures, it used to say May 3rd. The Joseph Smith papers have discovered that it actually was received on May 4th. And so like, that's a pretty low stakes thing, but it just reflects how much accuracy the church really does want to have in portraying our scriptural canon. Or the location, like section 105 on Fishing River, Missouri. Is that the, no, I don't know where.
That's disbanding Zion's camp. That's the whole, like, we were going to go redeem Zion with Zion's camp, but we get there and like, JK, you don't have to, a new thing. So that's section 105.
And they used to think it was on Fishing River, Missouri, but now they're like, oh, it was maybe about 4 miles north of that. So like pretty small adjustments and changes. Like section 2, which is about Moroni's visit to Joseph Smith, right? And it says it used to be the house of the prophet's father at Manchester, and now it says the Smith's log home at Palmyra. So, I mean, that's interesting, because that's a site that people do go visit. Latter-day Saints will go to upstate New York, they go to the sites, and then like the tour guides will tell them like, oh yeah, this was the place where Joseph Smith was visited by the angel Moroni. And we want to make sure that that is accurate and that that is being reflected in our printed text.
Could I just interject for a moment, Jasmine, and point something out that I think is kind of great about this? So we as Latter-day Saints sometimes are given a hard time by creedal Christians or other Bible-believing Christians, right, for the supposed lack of evidence for the Book of Mormon, lack of historical evidence or anything like that. Could you imagine having anywhere near the kind of specificity for the composition of biblical texts that we have for the Doctrine and Covenants in the historical record, where we can like nail down the exact date when these things were composed? We don't have anything like that for anything in the biblical canon. I mean, we have
Well,
like,
not just
Not only not not only can we specify the exact date, but location, and we can get the location so specific that like Jasmine was talking about with section 2, like we can be so specific that like we're like, oh, actually it wasn't in Manchester, it was 20 feet to the north or whatever in
yeah,
Palmyra.
that's right. In
Like
Palmyra
we can
instead.
be really like because the Smith farm, for those who don't understand, it actually straddled the boundary between Manchester and Palmyra. Right, and so they initially had a log home there in Palmyra. Then there was a frame home that was built on the Manchester side. And we can get so specific that we can tell which side of the line the revelation was received on.
Yeah.
That's actually really impressive.
Okay, not only the specificity,
sorry, go ahead, Jasmine.
but I was thinking as well about just the transparency of these documents. To my knowledge, I don't know of a single database in the biblical studies world where every single earliest manuscript and source relating to the biblical text is like scanned in and digitized and transcribed and translated and for free. Like just the complete breadth and depth of the Joseph Smith Papers project, I feel like is unprecedented in at least the biblical studies field. And it's just insane that anyone can access them, and anyone who actually wants to put in the effort to read has access to whatever primary source documents they want. Like that's insane.
I know I have friends who do like American history, early colonial America, Andrew Jackson, those guys, even time of Joseph Smith. And they have serious FOMO and envy for the Joseph Smith papers compared to like the John Quincy Adams papers or the Jefferson papers or something. Like we are so spoiled with the Joseph Smith papers, with the resources and the time and effort and attention they've thrown into this. So it is very impressive. I didn't mean to derail the conversation too much. I just thought that was very funny as we're going through. We can specify so precisely the origins and dates and composition of these texts. So something to think about, I guess.
Oh, for sure. Talk about historical transparency. I mean, what the Joseph Smith Papers has provided is more historical transparency than many other historical fields, because it's just so many resources have gone into making this accessible to literally anyone online.
Yeah.
So those were the minor corrections, and we can go through all of these if we really want, but most of them are they're very small. They're dates, May 19th versus May or June 1838. So there's just like more ambiguity. We didn't realize we actually were as certain as we thought we were. Or written by Joseph Smith the prophet in an epistle to the church dated this. Actually, section 121 is excerpted from 2 epistles to the church dictated by Joseph Smith and then dated around this time. So just like trying to provide as much precision as possible, or as much ambiguity as needed. If we're not actually certain about a date or not actually certain about a source, they're trying to, make sure that that is crystal clear, just to make sure no one is misled as they're reading their scriptures.
I think that the change to section 116 is interesting. An extract from Joseph Smith's history recounting a revelation, right, as opposed to a revelation given to. I think it's important to remember that Joseph Smith's manuscript history was a collaborative work amongst multiple clerks and secretaries. Joseph Smith obviously has a major role in composing that history, but it's not like it's just purely like straight from Joseph Smith at all times. And so little nuances like that are just, and if you notice, even here the language of section 116 is it's not like a verbatim thus saith the Lord type revelation type thing, right? Like it's recounting that Joseph Smith had a revelation about this thing, and then it's retelling it by a different hand of a different clerk or secretary working with Joseph Smith. So little nuances like that are important to keep in mind for some of these revelations. And I'm not saying that we therefore dismiss it or that it's not a revelation or that we can just chuck it out, but these little nuances can be important as we try to be more accurately attribute what is a direct thus saith the Lord revelation type thing that we get in the Doctrine and Covenants, as opposed to something like this in other sections, which are more sort of generalized retellings or recountings of revelations. I find that admirable that they're willing to, that the editors of the scriptures here are taking that into account.
Oh, for sure. So in addition to the minor ones, I think most people are probably interested in what are the more significant changes that have happened here. And so they made an entire separate page, or 2 pages really, or several pages, outlining some of the more substantive changes and why they made that change. We don't have to go through every single one, but there are a couple that I found were pretty interesting. This one, I mean, it's section 78, changed mercantile and publishing establishments to literary and mercantile establishments to more accurately reflect the original wording. So, like, still pretty minor. But this one, section 89, I thought was really interesting. So it says we changed basically what was the impetus for receiving the word of wisdom. Section 89 is the word of wisdom. And originally, the section said, as a consequence of the early brethren using tobacco in their meetings, the prophet was led to ponder upon the matter. Consequently, he inquired. Now they changed it to, as a consequence of the early brethren using tobacco in their meetings, and how that concerned his wife Emma Smith, the prophet inquired. And so this acknowledges Emma's role in receiving that revelation, which is really cool because I know, like, if you've ever visited Kirtland, Ohio, the tour guides will often talk about that, how Emma didn't like cleaning up after the tobacco, and that was like a matter of concern for her. And so Joseph inquired and then received this revelation upon asking that question. And so it's kind of cool to include Emma in the scriptures a little bit more overtly there.
Fun fact, do either of you know the other woman named in the Doctrine and Covenants besides Emma?
Vienna Jax?
Yeah, there you go. That's a fun little trivia for the day. Good job.
Well, you asked the question to the wrong person because I, if you didn't notice, am actually a woman. And so when women show up in the scriptures, like, I tend to notice. And I think a lot of women have that experience. You're like, oh, there's one of us. Okay,
That's really funny.
Some of these other ones that were added are like clarifying who else was involved in the revelation, or like where this took place, or the timing of receiving the revelation. The other one that I think was really noteworthy is section 119. And I don't know if, Stephen, you wanted to take this one because I know you were kind of pointing it out to us last night. But section 119 has a pretty big change.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Okay, so section 119 is all about basically tithing, right? And I'm going to pull it open right here because it's a short revelation. Actually, maybe Jasmine, you've got it right there. You've got it. Sorry, I mean to say I'm pulling it up on my own screen. It's a fairly short revelation, right? Section 119, and it's all about tithing basically. And okay, I think pretty much everybody at one point, if you're a member of the church, you have heard the following. Once upon a time, the Lord gave the church the law of consecration, which was that you give all your property to the church, and then the bishop will give you back the stuff that just you need for you and your family, right? And the surplus and the rest of it stays there with the bishop in the storehouse to be given to the poor or whatever, right? And the way the narrative goes, so that's from like section, I think it's 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants, right? No, I could be mistaken, but I think it's 42 is the whole law of consecration stuff. So the way the narrative goes is that we initially get law of consecration, but the early saints were a bunch of boneheads who weren't righteous enough to live the law of consecration, and they were bad, and they were wicked, and they were selfish and greedy. And so the Lord took away the, quote, higher law, the law of consecration, and he gave instead this thing we call tithing, the law of tithing, which is like a, quote, lesser law. And one day, when Jesus comes back, we will all be living the higher law, the law of consecration that was originally given, but we're not ready for that yet. And so now we just do tithing. So instead of giving all of our property to the church, we just give 10% of our money to the church, right? I think we've all have heard this at some point, right? Probably in like Sunday school classes or institute classes or things like that. Okay. The problem with this sort of narrative is that, like, it's basically just false in terms of, like, understanding what consecration is and what tithing is, okay? So let me, I was going to go, we don't need to go too much into it. I was actually going to look up law of consecration and stuff like that from section, like, 40 and 42 and so forth. Anyways, sorry, I'm thinking out loud.
At least in the way,
sorry,
when I
go
look
ahead.
at the Wayback Machine, and go to section 119, this is what it said it used to say, which, I mean, it's not quite as extreme as what you were portraying, but close enough. The Lord had previously given the law of consecration, but because of failure on the part of many to withdraw this covenant, the Lord withdrew it for a time. And so here's the law of tithing. But like you said, a lot of people have pointed out that we've never actually stopped living the law of consecration. We just live it differently today. The law of tithing was something additional that the Lord had revealed, but it wasn't a replacement for the law of consecration. And so then when we flip over to the current section today, it omits that sentence there and just talks about how, like, yeah, the Lord introduced the law of tithing, and this revelation came after suffering financial challenges.
Okay.
And the saints were also continuing to build up communities in Missouri.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I was pulling up on my end. It is section 42. I wanted to make sure I got the right section. Section 42 is like the quote unquote law of consecration revelation, right? Okay. So what happens is, and there's two really great works that I recommend on this. The first is by Lyndon Cook. He published it in 1985, and it's titled Joseph Smith and the Law of Consecration, right? Great little book. Steve Harper followed up just in the last couple of years with a book on the law of consecration. And Steve Harper, who's worked with the Joseph Smith papers, has done great stuff on this. And based on a careful reading of the historical evidence, here is kind of the new, the new sort of, I think, more properly contextual way to understand what the law of consecration was. And here's the TLDR. The law of consecration is that the saints will consecrate their time, talent, property, and everything which the Lord has blessed them to the building up of the kingdom of God on the earth, right? That's the covenants that we make in the temple with the endowment. That's the instruction the Lord gives to his saints in the Doctrine and Covenants. You will consecrate your properties to build up the kingdom and to alleviate the poor and the needy, okay? That law, that principle has always been operative in the church. The Lord has never taken away the law of consecration in the sense that we are obligated as covenant-keeping Latter-day Saints to consecrate our time, talent, and property to the building up of the church. What people are mistaking a lot of the time are the ways that the church over time has tried to implement and execute the law of consecration. So in Ohio and in Missouri, there were efforts made by Joseph Smith and other brethren to implement this law of consecration through entities they created, financial and other entities they created, such as what we now call the United Order. It was first called the United Firm, through like the literary firm. That was another one that was like printing church scriptures and stuff, through the mercantile firm, right? So the church attempted to implement this effort of consecration by establishing these different sort of entities, right, to implement that. That's where we run into problems when they're trying to implement it for a host of reasons. We don't need to get into all of them here. Lyndon Cook and Steve Harper and others have talked about them. The new revised section to D&C 119 mentions this. They're suffering financial challenges in Missouri. That includes, by the way, legal challenges, because when you give over your property to the church, there arose legal disputes over what is still like my property or not, right? So they had to change it where you get a deed and so forth. So they're sort of through trial and error trying to figure out how do we implement this. Then persecution comes, and what Lyndon Cook shows is the way it's being done in Missouri is not the same as it's being done in Ohio, and it's not the same way it's being done in Nauvoo, and it's not the same way it's being done in Utah in all material respects, right? So you with me so far? Basically, what we've done is over time, we've conflated the law of consecration with the efforts to live the law of consecration, like the United Order. Those two are not necessarily synonymous. And what this new revised heading to section 119 is teaching us is that tithing is one of these ways to implement and live the law of consecration. And it happens to be the system that is operative now in the church, right? So this is now how we today, based on this revelation, are living the law of consecration. Certainly in our individual lives, it goes deeper than that as we covenant keep the law. But on an institutional level, this is the Lord's expectation for his church on how to implement and safeguard the law of consecration. So without yammering too much, I hope that makes sense, right? Don't confuse the law of consecration itself with the different methods or ways that people have tried to live the law of consecration in the church, and tithing is one of those methods.
So we've got a couple interesting comments. And so one person, Rodney James McGuire, said that it's kind of odd to change scripture unilaterally without a canonization vote. He later qualified that like, well, I guess it is just the headings. And we did talk about how none of the actual text of the revelations or scriptures are being changed. It's just the headings or the introductory stuff. But still, it does bring up the question, what would it take to actually change scripture, whether it's to receive a new revelation or to make changes to the actual text of the scriptures? Does it require a vote of canonization? Is that something the church can just unilaterally do? Do you guys know?
I do know, as a matter of fact. I don't know. I don't want to filibuster. Neil, do you have anything you want to say before I go on another rant?
Well, I was just going to say when they made the changes in 2013, they made textual changes in at least a few instances with the Book of Mormon. I can't remember if they made any textual changes in other places, but they have made textual modifications before, and I don't think it requires a vote. I think the only time you need like the common consent sort of vote is when there is a new revelation or new material being added to the canon, a new section of the Doctrine and Covenants, a new something to the
Declaration.
yeah, something along those lines.
Right. So Neil's basically right. Our friend Brian Passantino is writing his dissertation on this topic, on the history of canonization. He and I have touched on this in our book we did on Joseph Smith's Uncanonized Revelations. And what we have found, funny enough, with the exception of the Book of Mormon and the Bible, which were just accepted like as de facto scripture, every time there's been a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, or when the Pearl of Great Price was canonized, or when new sections were canonized, every time the church has done this at a general conference, it went up to a sustaining vote along with the general authorities and officers of the church to sustain the new edition of the scriptures, basically, as being binding scriptures on the saints. So it happens in 1880 when they canonized the Pearl of Great Price, and when they canonized Orson Pratt's 1876 revision of the Doctrine and Covenants. It happens in 1902 when they do a new edition of the Pearl of Great Price. It happens again in 1921 when they do a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. It happened in 1976 when they added 2 new portions to the Pearl of Great Price, what are now section 137 and 138 of the Doctrine and Covenants. April 1976, you can even see it. They have footage of it. It was filmed. And Eldon Tanner saying, "It has been approved by the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency to add these new revelations to the Pearl of Great Price. All in favor, please manifest it," right? But Neil is right. That's when we're talking about significant additions or changes to the canon in the form of like canonizing or decanonizing content. When we're talking about minor textual variations, seems like we don't need to necessarily go through the whole rigmarole of a sustaining vote, since it's not like materially affecting the status of the canon, if that makes sense.
And let's be real. Do any of us want to have to do that? Like, if they make, let's say they decided to accept several hundred of Royal Skousen's textual emendations to the Book of Mormon. Do any of us really want to like have the whole church have to like go through all of those textual emendations and decide like, yeah, that, you know, I approve that. Like, no, we don't want that. It's fine. You know, they're all pretty minor. All the changes, like especially these, which aren't even to the actual content, but you know, it's not something that like they're not like rewriting the doctrine and then being like, aha, these are our scriptures. It's, you know, when there's a new revelation, when there's new content to be added to the scriptures, yes, that needs to be taken to the body of the saints, right, for the sustaining vote. But little textual emendations, nobody wants, we don't need the whole body of saints to micromanage that, and none of us want to.
So that does bring up something that someone else brought up in the comments. It was the YGDS saying, honestly, I think this is something they can update routinely in electronic formats as data comes forth, and I think the Book of Mormon headings could use updating. So I think that's an interesting point. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that the church has announced changes and they've just kind of taken place digitally and just not silently, but it just rolled out immediately. Whereas in 2013, it was a really big deal that like there's going to be a new printing of these scriptures. This is officially the new version, and it is like set in stone until the next big project for revising this. And so that the fact that they just kind of like rolled this out immediately digitally does make me wonder if this is going to be something that happens more regularly going forward, kind of like the temple changes. It was a really big deal when the temple was changed for the first time in many, many years. But then all of a sudden, President Nelson started making a lot more regular updates and adjustments and tweaks as needed. And so I wonder if we're going to see something similar moving forward, because we have just the digital means to do that now.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think they said in the article that they were going to make these changes reflected in print as well eventually, but this wasn't going to be like as big a thing. I don't know.
Well, given how many print copies they have out there, it makes sense to like run through the printing edition, the print run you have now, and then we do a new one to then incorporate the changes in the print version. So that makes sense to just push it out digitally and then catch up later on the print version of it.
I do think this has already been the model for some time. I'm pretty sure in 2013 they also just made the changes digitally right away. So I think this has just already been the model for a while.
Now, one thing I do wonder is to what extent this reflects like President Oaks's initiative versus something that's just been in the queue for a long time. I suspect the latter, that even though, this is technically the first change President Oaks has really made institutionally across the board, new scriptures, my guess is that this was in the works for a while among the Quorum of the 12 in the first presidency, and it's just taken a while to roll out, especially with the mission changes we're going to talk about soon as well. So this isn't necessarily representative of like, this is the new tone of President Oaks's presidency, but nonetheless, I do wonder what this holds. Part of me wonders if the reason we got these two announcements back to back like this was because we've kind of had a bottleneck in church announcements with the passing of President Nelson. Once he passed, there was, a moratorium, and the church really focused on that for a long time. Then it was General Conference. And so there wasn't really like opportunity to start rolling out the announcements that may have already been in the queue for a while. So who knows? I wonder, okay, this speculation just popped in my head as we were speaking, and so there's no grounding in anything there. But this conference, we didn't announce any new temples. President Oaks said, we're just going to catch up on the ones we're working on. We won't be announcing temples this time. Part of me wonders, it would have been so cool if like this announcement about opening up 55 new missions was actually in the queue, and maybe they were going to make that announcement during General Conference, but because of all the events that had unfolded, they're like, we'll just save it for later. But that would have been a mic drop moment if they had announced that in General Conference.
Well, to answer your question, Jasmine, about whether this was a sudden thing or if this was in the works for a while, I would like to quote what is, in my humble opinion, the greatest sci-fi novel ever written ever, and it is Frank Herbert's Dune, which is fantastic, and both the adaptations are very good, but especially the new one by Denis Villeneuve. Anyways, in Dune, there's the famous line, for all of you nerds out there, you know who the Bene Gesserit are. I don't know if either of you two nerds have read Dune, but it's amazing. The Bene Gesserit are basically like a bunch of like space nuns who use magic. Anyways, point is, they have this line where it says like, we lay out our plans in centuries, right? And if you read the novel, like you kind of see why they say that. That's kind of like with the church. They lay out their plans and maybe not centuries, but certainly, like months or years. Very few things I think happen that spontaneously. So I'm pretty certain. And I say it because I know that there's commenters also asking it as well, that almost certainly this was probably several years in the work of church historians, Joseph Smith Papers people, and they run it up the flagpole, right? Goes to Elder McKay, the church historian, then to the scripture committee, then to the correlation committee, then to the 12, and so forth. So I'm sure it was a long time in the work, and just now we're getting to announcing it.
I do think I agree. This was almost certainly something that was already in the works, but in the spirit of questions about President Oaks's initiative versus President Nelson's initiative, and some people have been wondering whether, speculating whether the thing about using the full name of the church is going to continue under President Oaks or not. I do think it is worth pointing to. Obviously, a lot of the excitement is around changes in the section headings of the Doctrine and Covenants, but there are two changes to the Book of Mormon. One of them to 3 Nephi 27, and it says it changed from Jesus commands them to call the church in his name to Jesus commands that the church be called in his name. And the explanation for why this adjustment was made. This clarifies that the command applies to us in our day as well as to the people of Nephi. So we are seeing a continuation here of the emphasis on the church being called after the name of Jesus Christ, and that being something that is important to our day right now, not just to the Nephites in antiquity. So while I agree that these are probably changes that were in the works for a while, this would be emblematic here, especially like I'm sure this brief explanation for the reasons why could have been adapted if President Oaks wanted it to, but this does suggest that we are going to continue to operate under the assumption that the emphasis is going to be on the full name of the church, the proper name of the church, and making sure we are not removing the name of Christ as we talk about who we are and what we do. So,
no, I love it. There are like a couple other things from these D&C changes I thought were pretty noteworthy. One of them was, so in D&C 109, this is the dedicatory prayer of the Kirtland Temple. Apparently it used to say, according to the prophet's written statement, this prayer was given to him to revelation, and it was changed to, the prayer had been given to the prophet and other church leaders by revelation as they worked late the previous night to prepare it. And so this removes the reference to the prophet's written statement, which apparently is not extant. So that prophet's written statement does not survive to the current day. And so they adjusted it to talk about how the prophet and other church leaders worked on it. And I just thought that was interesting. I don't know, I guess my assumption was reading the Kirtland dedicatory prayer that the prophet had just like prayed about it and received that, and that was it. But this sounds like it was a more collaborative effort there to pray and to ponder about what really should be said in this very sacred event to dedicate the house of the Lord. So I thought that was pretty cool. And speaking of Kirtland Temple, section 110 is at the Kirtland Temple when Jesus Christ and Moses and Elias appear to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and others and gives them the keys. And they added the context that this was on Easter Sunday, not just after a Sabbath meeting. So that's kind of cool, just like a gee whiz thing. And then I guess, yeah, those are probably the biggest ones I thought were noteworthy. Were there any other sections you guys thought you wanted to touch on?
You've got section 132 right there.
Oh,
I find that really interesting. Yeah.
That one is interesting. It's just a date, but it has some interesting implications. So this says changed as early as 1831 to earlier. So let me bring up D&C 132 so we know what we're talking about here. D&C 132 is the section where Joseph Smith receives the revelation on plural marriage. It's recorded on 1843, and it says that although the revelation was recorded in 1843, evidence indicates that some of the principles involved in the revelation were known by the prophet earlier. So it just makes it a little bit more vague than what the previous version was, which said as early as 1831. So Stephen or Neil, could you talk to maybe why some of that ambiguity exists?
I certainly can, but Neil, do you want to take it?
Well, we'll let Stephen do it, but I was just going to note even the expression as early as 1831 is actually kind of a weaselly, vague statement. Like it implies a really early date, 1831, but it's actually not committing to 1831. It just says, yeah, these principles could have been known as early as 1831. Like that was like the earliest possible date. And so I would agree that like changing to just earlier is probably better because the bottom line is we don't actually know exactly how early some of these principles were known to Joseph Smith.
So why 1831? Is that because that's when the Joseph Smith translation was happening and he was asking those questions, or what?
Yeah, so that date basically comes from people like Orson Pratt and Helen Mar Kimball and others who in their reminiscent accounts said things, or even like Miranda Nancy Johnson, right, the Johnson farm in Ohio, right? These saints practicing plural marriage in Utah, in Nauvoo and then Utah, they left reminiscent accounts saying things like, well, I remember in my father's farm in Hiram, Ohio in 1831 and 1832 when the prophet was taught about celestial marriage, but he had to keep it a secret then. Or Orson Pratt would say things like he was teaching it secretly in 1831, that, after translating the Bible. So yeah, that date basically comes from later reminiscent accounts from those practicing plural marriage. Now, they are close to Joseph Smith, and it's very possible and likely they were getting information from Joseph Smith, but it's difficult to say with specificity 1831 if you take at face value these later reminiscent accounts. As Neil indicated, we don't have contemporary evidence to verify that, and so it's best to be a little more vague in order to not like overcommit to the idea that like, oh yeah, in 1831 Joseph Smith knew about plural marriage. Certainly possible that he knew about aspects of it. The JST translation is a good candidate for when Joseph Smith is probably being tipped off about plural marriage being a thing, since he would have encountered. I know this isn't convenient for some people, but there's plural marriage in the Bible. There's polygamy in the Bible, and he would have encountered those stories at that time when he's translating the Old Testament in 1831. So that's where they got that date. And like B.H. Roberts enshrined this as the date in like History of the Church and then some of his writings as like, oh yeah, by this point, as this early, he was learning about plural marriage. I just think that we need to be more cautious, and so it's appropriate to reflect that with this revise. It's true, and it's very likely, quote, earlier he had received aspects of this revelation or teaching. I think that's very defensible, very likely.
Well,
but I don't know if we can
not
say as
only-
early as 1831, taking these later accounts at face value.
I don't know. It's not only likely, like it's indisputable, though. I
Yeah.
guess go watch our polygamy denier episode, because there are people who dispute all of it, I guess. But it's indisputable that he was practicing polygamy
Right, before 18
July 1843, and so unless you just reject that he's a prophet altogether, which obviously a lot of people do, but if we accept that he's a prophet and that he's doing this according to Revelation, then the very fact that he's practicing it before 1843 is de facto evidence that these principles had been revealed to him before 1843. And so there's no doubt that it was earlier, but how much earlier?
Right.
And yeah, 1831 is a really early date.
I mean,
which
we do
have very
have
little
the-
evidence for.
We do have the purported William Phelps version of a revelation, right, saying, go take you wives among the Lamanites. That's reportedly from 1831, right? That's supposed to
Right.
be pretty early. Of course, and here's my shameless plug to go buy my book. Brian Passantino and I describe it in our book. I think it's pretty dubious that revelation can be attributed to Joseph Smith, at least, shall we say, in the form that William Phelps preserves it in the 1860s. I'm doubtful we can attribute it uncritically to Joseph Smith. But there is indication, right? There is some evidence. It's just not, I think, strong enough to have an ironclad statement. As early as 1831, we have indication of this. Maybe, but for sure by Kirtland with Fanny Alger, and super for sure by Nauvoo. Before 1843, we have plural marriage. But yeah, for all the reasons Neil said, I agree it's best to make that change.
All right. Well, any other comments people want to make on the changing of the Doctrine and Covenants? I know, Stephen, you have quite a few editions of the Doctrine and Covenants yourself, and you've done a lot of studying on the revelations that made it into the Doctrine and Covenants. So do you want to just take like a minute to talk about changes that have been made and show us some of your fancy books?
Yeah, I'll be happy to, and I'll keep it brief. We don't want to do show and tell for too much. Okay, boys and girls, gather around for show and tell on the history of the Doctrine and Covenants. And I have some fun past editions here. So these are facsimile reprints because real ones are really expensive. 1833 Book of Commandments. I don't know if you can see it there, but anyways, Book of Commandments. These are this little facsimile that you can buy for like $20 or whatever. So we all know the Book of Commandments, right? This is what they wanted to publish in Missouri. The mob famously or infamously destroys the press in July of 1833. Some of the sheets of the printed revelations are saved, and they are bound in Kirtland as the Book of Commandments. My understanding is like 20 of these exist left, like originals, and they go for like up to $1 million or more. Earlier this year, I got to actually handle and see Jacob Whitmer's copy of the Book of Commandments, which was kind of fun. So this Book of Commandments, this is our like proto Doctrine and Covenants, if you want to call it that, our first attempt to publish the Revelations. 1835, Doctrine and Covenants comes out. Again, here's a little facsimile reprint that you can just go get online. It's kind of fun, right? Doctrine and Covenants, 1835. This is summer of 1835 when this comes out. And what's funny is the doctrine part of the Doctrine and Covenants is this thing that we call the Lectures on Faith. They call it Lectures on Theology. So our first edition has both the Lectures on Faith, the quote, the doctrine part, and then the Covenants part. Covenants and Commandments is what they call it. That's our revelations, our sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. So this is 1835. I don't have printings here, but in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith is preparing a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants in Nauvoo. Unfortunately, he is martyred before he can complete it, and so it gets published shortly after he is martyred. It includes, at the last minute, they stick in what is now D&C 135, right? The eulogy for Joseph and Hiram. That's going to be the standard edition for the next 30 years until you get to the 1870s, and this is an original copy. This is a printing from the early 1880s, but this is the 1876, what we call the Orson Pratt or Salt Lake edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, right? Orson Pratt retains the lectures on faith. He also rearranges the content to make it more sequential, like chronologically. Orson Pratt's also going to add like 20, I think it's 26 new sections of the Doctrine and Covenants in this edition. This includes like the Liberty Jail letters, section 131, 132, right? Section 136, Revelation to Brigham Young on organizing the saints to come out west. So that's this one. It still has lectures on faith. So that's 1876. All right, pop quiz, Neil and Jasmine. So the manifesto from Wilford Woodruff is given in 1890. Do you know when they started including it in the Doctrine and Covenants? What year?
I haven't the faintest clue.
It was.
Neil?
I don't think it was till like 1978 or something, or 1981, because I think
Well,
it
that's Official
initially it was-
Declaration too. But Official
Right, but
Declaration 1, the manifesto.
Wasn't this initially put in the Pearl of Great Price? Wasn't the manifesto from Wilford Woodruff originally put in the Pearl of Great Price?
No, not exactly. You're kind of thinking the right idea. Here it appears in 1908, and this is a 1908 Doctrine and Covenants.
Okay.
So that's when they start publishing it, and I can actually open it up here. So it comes at the very end. They stick in official declaration. This is our official declaration number 1. So starting in 1908 is when we get our official declaration. We also still have the lectures on faith. Hopefully you both know, maybe you know, when did they remove the lectures on faith from the Doctrine and Covenants?
You've got to stop doing these pop quizzes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Actually,
Yeah,
I
Neil
should
got
know.
it.
I remember taking a Pearl of Great Price class
1921,
and having to
yeah.
learn this.
So 1921 edition, this is an original, is when they decanonize the lectures on faith. They also do a major new edition of the Pearl of Great Price and the Book of Mormon all at the same time. They kind of
Is
do them
Lectures on
together in
Faith-
batches.
Is the Lectures
Yeah.
on Faith the only thing we've ever decanonized?
We have also decanonized the Statement on Marriage. Do you remember that? Our polygamy denier friends
okay,
love
yeah.
it. The 1835, which is here in this one, and then Orson Pratt, it's decanonized in the 1876 edition and replaced with section 132. So besides that, yeah, we've also decanonized the Lectures on Faith. So that gets taken out in 1921. This is our Doctrine and Covenants in the church for like 60 years, which is kind of funny, right? Like this is it. So what Neil is thinking about is that in 1976 is when we had 2 revelations added to the Pearl of Great Price. Those are Joseph Smith's vision of the celestial kingdom and
right.
Joseph F. Smith's vision of the spirit world. Those are moved to the Doctrine and Covenants in 1979. So that's probably what you're thinking of, Neil, is that, we moved stuff from the Pearl of Great Price to the DNC. I have those editions here. So in 1981 is when the church does the edition we now basically use today. This is where we have 1 and 2 and sections 137 and 138. So what is that now? All pushing 50 years now or something like that, 1981 almost, where we have 40-something years, right? 45 years or whatever is how long we have had this as sort of our official edition. 2013 is when they do the major rehaul or overhaul of the introductions and things like that, reflecting the Joseph Smith papers, and now the ones we have today. So there you go. There's your little crash course. I highly recommend you check out a book called How We Got the Doctrine and Covenants by Richard Turley. Plug for our Informed Saints podcast. We just interviewed him on President Oakes' biography, so check that out. So there's a lot of great work on the history of the Doctrine and Covenants. One of them is Rick Turley's book, How We Got the Doctrine and Covenants. And the giant nerd that I am, I have my nice little collection. It's also behind me here, my other old editions of the Book of Mormon and Pearl of Great Price and stuff. And that's how we got where we are today. And the punchline here being, boys and girls, we are a church with an open canon. And so it's always a little funny to me when I see people kind of get concerned when they make adjustments or changes to the scripture. I'm like, that's a feature, not a bug of our religion, is having an open canon where modern living prophets can adapt and reconstitute the contents of the canon, right? And so that
Well,
just a little bit of
I
material culture for you to show you where we got from where we were in the past to where we are now.
I do think that for most people, when we talk about open canon, uh, they tend to envision adding, right? Like we think open canon, oh, that means we can get more, but they don't tend to think of it in the context of obviously taking away, like removing lectures on faith or stuff. We don't think about it in that context very often, and we don't usually think about it in the context of this kind of stuff that we're talking about today, which is just like adjustments and tweaks to the standard works as they're printed and presented, for use and study by members of the church today. But all of that really is part of what it means to have an open canon, to have flexibility, right? Openness, flexibility to changes and adjustments as needed as we learn more about the canon as we have it, which is, I mean, you'll notice there's only 2 changes to the Book of Mormon, and it was all Doctrine and Covenants, because this is really the fruit of the Joseph Smith papers more than
Yeah.
anything else, right? And
By the way, I
it's
just want to
great
mention to that point, Neil, if people are concerned with the church today changing contents to the Doctrine and Covenants, guess what happens between the Book of Commandments and the first edition Doctrine and Covenants? Guess who feels totally at liberty to go and revise his revelations to reflect updates to church hierarchy, church doctrine, church teaching, stuff that had been revealed to him? Guy by the name of Joseph Smith. So if you're going to get mad at Heber J. Grant or Spencer W. Kimball or Dallin H. Oaks or whoever for making adjustments to the scripture, you got to get mad at Joseph Smith for doing it, because between the Book of Commandments and the Doctrine and Covenants, and between the 3 editions of the Book of Mormon that he edits in his lifetime, he makes textual revisions and updates as well to his own revelations he gave. So sorry, if that's a problem for you, take it up with Joseph Smith.
Well, that's an excellent point. And the reality is we have an open canon, so adjustments and changes are to be expected, not anything to be concerned about. But it's also like just very exciting. And we should emphasize that it's not that we're changing the canon willy-nilly. Like the last time we made changes in 2013, they said that that was a process of 8 years of preparing those changes. And even then, I think there are many historians that wish there were even more changes. The church was very conservative in the changes they made. And so now that we're making adjustments again, I'm sure that this had been long deliberated. I'm certain that it went to the highest levels for approval before actually making these changes to the scriptures. We have an open canon, but we don't have a casual canon, so to speak. So, besides just the changes to the scriptures, the other big bomb that was dropped today was that 55 new missions were announced, which I don't know which announcement is like the bigger deal, if I'm being honest, because all of it sounds pretty wild to me. But okay, where's my tab with the church just announces new? Here we go. Okay, so the Church of Jesus Christ announces the addition of 55 new missions in 2026. These new missions will help accommodate a rising number of missionaries and bring the worldwide total to 506 missions. That's pretty crazy. This is the infographic that they've put together for us, which kind of blows my mind. And to put it in context, I think this is the biggest announcement of missions we've had in a long time. We liked to think of President Nelson being the one making all the changes, but I don't think we've had an announcement this large since. Now, I did find a church news article from 2023 saying that the Church of Jesus Christ will create 36 new missions in 2024. So we're, about 2 years after that, and the last biggest batch was 36 missions big. And President Nelson has announced other mission changes and additions and reboundaries several times, but this is the biggest one. So, that's amazing. And I kind of wish they announced it in conference, because that would have been just such an epic mic drop of we're not going to announce temples, but 55 new missions. Now, most people probably don't understand how it, the magnitude of what that really means. And to be honest, I don't entirely, because I never served a proselyting mission myself. But I don't know. Can you guys give me a little bit of context of okay, what does it mean to create a new mission? What needs to happen there? What does that mean for the work?
I'm not entirely sure what the criteria are for like how much member support they need to open a mission, but I'm pretty sure it's similar to, you know, whenever they want to create a ward or a stake, right? You have to have a certain amount of membership. You've got to have enough like reliable priesthood holders. You've got to have all of that kind of stuff, and then you've got to scale that significantly because a mission is several stakes, right? Are gonna operate within a mission, but I'm not entirely sure of those things. But here's what I can say that I think gives a little context here. So the infographic that the church released with this shows that there are 84,000 total missionaries right now. When President Monson made the age change back in 2012, and so there was like a huge influx of missionaries, the number of missionaries then peaked at 88,000. So and then it crested down because that was like a wave that came in as like more kids became eligible all at once, right? Than were eligible before, and so there was this big wave, and so for it to have like rebounded back up to 84,000 now after I think it got up to 88, and then it receded down to 65,000. And now it's crested back up to 84,000. I don't know what's going on that there's that many more missionaries all of a sudden, but that's huge. That is a massive increase in missionaries, and nearly 20,000, 19,000 more missionaries than there were 3 years ago in 2022. And so, I mean, if you do the math there, 19,000 divided by 55 missions, you know, how many missionaries per mission is that we're talking about? And that's probably your best indication about like how significant it is to add 55 missions, right?
And so it sounds to me like the addition of missions, because at least what this infographic is showing, it is showing total number of missionaries in the field, which makes me think that making these new missions is a lot more related to the number of missionaries than the number of like converts we're seeing. This is more related to, okay, the program is growing, so we've got to accommodate that growth. And maybe my guess would be also a desire to make sure that the ratio of like leader to missionary is a little bit more healthy. Because I know a couple years ago, the church announced that they were also going to try to reduce the size of the minimums for like wards and branches and stakes because they wanted a better ratio of like leadership to members to make sure that more of the flock was being ministered to. I can only imagine that a similar impulse can sometimes motivate church leaders to say we want to make sure the missionaries are getting support that they need, and so you don't want to have one mission leadership couple being over like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of missionaries that they just can't keep track of. So yeah, I don't
know. We have a commenter, the Vogeldon, who I think is a friend of ours, but we won't dox him. The Vogeldon says, some of it was almost certainly because of geography and logistics. Mongolia, for example, is twice the size of Texas. That's kind of what I figured too, right? I'm looking at how many new African missions there are. That's awesome. Look at this. Africa Central, Africa South, Africa West. That's pretty amazing. So I think besides, like church growth and other factors, just like these are huge tracts of land that you've got to manage better. And one way you can do that is just by subdividing it into, more smaller missions. So I think that's kind of good. I did notice a Toronto East mission. There we go. Let's go Toronto. Go Blue Jays. That's where I did my master's degree for.
So there were a lot that were made in the United States that I thought was interesting because I don't tend to think of the United States as an area of as much growth as like Africa, let's say, and Africa certainly had a lot. So let's see, they have Africa Central adding 4 missions, Africa South adding 5 more, Africa West adding more, and Africa North. So 17 new missions were created in Africa just alone. So clearly that's an area of a ton of growth. Brazil had 3, Canada is 2. There's your Toronto. Stephen's an alumnus from the Canada area. Europe Central having 3 new missions, which is interesting because Europe tends to have this reputation of being very low growth when it comes to conversions to the gospel. A lot in the Pacific, the Philippines, South America Northwest, South America South, but then a ton in the United States itself. And again, that's just interesting to me that so many are being made in the United States. I wonder if that is indicative of growth or if it's indicative of like where the church wants to send more missionaries. If we're getting all these missionaries, where are they going to call them? I wonder if they do feel the need to call more to the United States for one reason or another. I don't know, but very, very interesting. Doesn't look like they made any new missions in Utah, though.
But they did make a new Virginia-Norfolk mission. So my mission has been split. It actually was split once before when they did the new missions with the surge of missionaries in 2012 or 2013. They split it between the Virginia Richmond and the Virginia Chesapeake mission. My understanding is that in 2019 or thereabouts, as that total number of missionaries was coming down, they actually remerged those. So it's now been split into two again with the Virginia Norfolk mission, which they also recently announced a temple for in Norfolk, Virginia. So, go Virginia.
Okay, someone in the comments made an excellent point. They said, does any effect come from service missionaries being added to the number increase? Does it include service missionaries? I think the answer is yes. So the church made a change that before service missionaries would just report to their stake president, and that would be their mission. But now they're included as part of whatever proselyting mission they happen to geographically be a part of. So if you live in Provo, Utah, and you're a service missionary, you're going to be part of the Provo, Utah mission. So that honestly explains a lot of this, I imagine. A lot of the growth coming in the United States is probably because now service missionaries, many of whom are coming from the United States, are probably going to be serving where they live in the United States. So there you go. It is interesting that Texas got 3 new ones and California got 3 new ones. So those 2 states are growing missionaries. Very, very exciting.
I noticed the Kansas City mission in Missouri, so I guess the Chiefs are going to have a mission all for themselves. I wonder if that's going to, because I know there's an Independence mission. I wonder if they're splitting off from Independence, right, to give them Kansas City or something. It's kind of fun to speculate on some of these missions and kind of how they'll overlap with others and what they'll end up doing or the areas they'll end up covering.
So true. Well, any final thoughts on the sharing of the new missions or the scriptures? That I don't know. I'm pretty jazzed about this. I do feel like this is an indication of, hopefully it portends massive growth for the church. I do feel like as we head towards a new presidency with President Dallin H. Oaks, I don't know what that's going to look like as far as policies. I don't know what that's going to look like as far as changes he's going to make. But I can only assume that this rush of missionaries we're getting in the field is an indication of good things to come, that the Lord is hastening the work, that we're going to be seeing growth in various areas of the world that we weren't before. And who knows, even the idea that we're getting more service missionaries in the field than we ever have before. And so more people are staying where they are, and they're not necessarily proselyting, but they are serving. I'm interested to see if that ends up having an impact on the missionary work in the United States. I'm excited thinking about those possibilities.
Yes, it's very exciting. Always good to see growth. Always good to see new missions. I think that portends good things. I don't know, man. With talking about the changes to the scriptures, I think it's nice to change headings and things like that to be more accurate. But Royal Skousen's critical text of the Book of Mormon, his critical text project. I mean, while we're at it, let's make some changes to the Book of Mormon to go back to the original manuscript and stuff that we found from Royal Skousen's work.
Heck, so you're one of those historians that wish there were more changes made in the 2013 edition of the text.
Absolutely. I think that, what's funny is because with Royal Skousen's work, some of his changes are conjectural emendations, or they're conjectural changes, right? So it's like, based on the manuscript's history, this is maybe what we think is the best reading. Others, according to his work, are just like demonstrably, this is what's in, the original manuscript. And later it got, Oliver Cowdery miscopied it, and then not E.B. Grandin, the typesetter. John Gilbert then, mispunctuated or whatever. And then James E. Town, blah, 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 blah. So, there's certainly some things I think we could go back to while we're at it. Let's just come on, scoot in some of the critical text from Royal Skousen. I also want to have 10 minutes of President Oaks's time to let him know, just so you know, we have 40 revelations from Joseph Smith that haven't been canonized. Let's just sneak them in there while we're at it, while we're updating the headers. Let's just sneak in some
Now-
more revelations from Joseph Smith. Hey,
Now, Stephen, those
If
would
you-
require the sustaining vote. Those are
I'm just
new
saying-
revelations added to the canon.
I'm just saying, if we put in the revelations to Sarah Ann Whitney and Miranda Nancy Johnson that Joseph Smith receives, we would increase by 100% the references of women in the scriptures or in the Doctrine and Covenants. We'd go from 2 to 4 women being mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. So maybe that's the way to do it. I don't know. I'm kind of just teasing, but it is always fun when we get these new adjustments and updates. And we have lots of great work by great scholars and others that are giving us the best scriptures we can get, and I'm happy for that.
Okay, so if someone wanted to learn more about these changes, like textual emendations, the manuscript history of the scriptures, or how changes have been made to our scriptures in the past, where do people go?
So I mentioned Rick Turley's book, How We Got the Doctrine and Covenants. He also did a book called How We Got the Book of Mormon. Those are both very good. Royal Skousen has done the exhaustive, authoritative, critical text of the Book of Mormon, where he goes through the manuscripts, O and P. He goes through all the printed editions to show us exactly where we ended up, where we are here. Again, for our Christian friends who love the Bible, guess what? We can do this with Book of Mormon manuscripts, and in some ways, we can do it even better with Book of Mormon manuscripts than we can with biblical manuscripts, showing exactly where we end up from A to Z in terms of our readings and our text. So check out Royal Skousen's work. It's invaluable in that regard. Joseph Smith Papers has great stuff on the origins of the different sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. You can go read the original, or the not the original because we don't have them most of the time, but the earliest extant manuscript copies. You can see those. I mean, there's a ton of stuff out there on the Doctrine and Covenants alone. Lyndon Cook has done a bunch of really good stuff on this. I mean, how far back do you want to go? There's guys in the 1970s who are doing their dissertations on the Robert C. Woods, I think, on the development of the Doctrine and Covenants. But Joseph Smith Papers is a good place to go to get your grounding on the historical sources.
In fact, you don't even need to go to the Joseph Smith Papers. If you go to the Church History Library on the church website, they have, and then you go under Doctrine and Covenant Study, they have a little section, a publication called Joseph Smith's Revelations, a Doctrine and Covenant Study Companion from the Joseph Smith Papers. And this is all of the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, but the earliest manuscript copy that we have of every single revelation that's in the Doctrine and Covenants. So if you, this is actually something I introduced. I'm a gospel doctrine teacher, so I actually introduced my class to this at the beginning of the year. And, this is one way to study the Doctrine and Covenants as you go through the year, is to maybe go to these early texts, these early versions of the text, and read these instead of, the usual study you might do if you want something fresh or new. One thing I would caution, though, is the canon is the canon, right? And the edition of the text that is canonized, that's the version of the revelation that we consider authoritative today. So don't make the mistake of maybe following some of the changes. Like, it's good to know for historical purposes, like how the revelation originally read or the earliest extant copy reads. But the version that is authoritative and binding on the church today is the version that's published by the church, right? And so while all of this is useful and fun for all kinds of purposes, you do need to keep in mind that what's actually authoritative scripture is the published canon as published by the church.
Hear, hear. So if you want to learn more, obviously go to the church newsroom where they've made these announcements and you can see those articles, and then definitely look into the resources Stephen and Neil have recommended.